Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. What Celia and Jack failed to say is that I actually asked for this invitation. I think it's very cheeky, isn't it, to ask for an invitation to come and speak at a conference. But I've chaired this session several times before at the ESDS conference, and one of the things that I was very aware of is that it's quite difficult as a user to understand how the different bits of the statistical system internationally fit together and how policies are set about data access, and where you go to for different parts of the, for different statistics or statistical services. So I'm giving a fairly basic introduction. This is not going to be a profound talk about the role of the international agencies, and I very much welcome your views and comments afterwards and questions. I may be pitching this wrongly. If I am doing, I do apologise, but I hope this basic introduction will help. So we need to start with the core of the international statistical system, which is two divisions in New York, in particular the UN Statistics Division, a division of about 70 staff, and the UN Population Division. Both of these report, of course there's two reporting systems in the UN, as you'll be aware, one the Security Council and one the Economic and Social Research Council. And of course, statistics and population report through to the Economic and Social Research Council. The UN Statistics Division, its main role is coordination of statistical activities, publication of compendia. In the main, it doesn't get involved in direct data collection. And I think that's really important to appreciate, that it's mainly coordination and bringing together statistics that are produced by other agencies that I'll talk about in a few minutes. It does, in that bringing together and that coordination role, publish compendia and, of course, increasingly online compendia. And it has a particular function in relation to censuses, and especially the censuses in developing countries. So one of the ways in which it coordinates and promotes good practice in statistical activities is by producing various manuals and so on. And in the past, it's produced manuals on topics such as household surveys, but every 10 years for the decennial census cycle, there's a new census manual produced by the UN in New York, and then some of the regional commissions adapt that census manual to their own needs. So it has a particular role in terms of supporting, promoting and helping census activities. And of course it's the Secretariat to the UN Statistics Commission, and I'll talk in a few minutes about the UN Statistics Commission. The UN Population Division, in contrast, is much, much smaller and very focused, and its role is really about producing population estimates and population projections for the world. So it's a user of statistics, it's not a data gatherer. So that's sort of at the core of the statistics system. Now, one needs to appreciate, in understanding the statistical system, how the UN agencies fit together. And this is my terminology, sister and daughter. It's not official terminology, but I find it helpful to distinguish between different types of specialist agencies. So we've got the UN in New York with member states, and then we've got sister agencies that have their own Director Generals who do not report to the Secretary General of the UN. And these sister agencies have different sets of countries that belong. So that they are funded through member states paying dues and project funding and so on. And there's a different set of countries, of course largely overlapping, because we have in the case of UNESCO, for example, which I know most about, having worked there for 7 years, we have, I think it's about 191 member states at the moment. And so a similar number to the UN in New York, but it's not an identical set of countries. So there are some countries that belong to UNESCO and don't belong to the UN, and vice versa, a small number of countries. But what's really important to appreciate is that these agencies, these sister agencies, they don't report through to the UN Secretary General. So their heads of those agencies are elected and appointed by the member states of who belong to those agencies. Okay, so the Director General of WHO, Margaret Chan, doesn't report through to Ban Ki-moon. And you may think that I'm being a bit picky, but it's really important that you appreciate this, because this isn't a hierarchy in terms of the statistical system. There are then what I've called daughter agencies, and these are agencies which have at their head usually somebody called a chief executive or a director or some title like that, and they are actually appointed by the Secretary General of the UN, and they report through to the Secretary General of the UN, and they do not have separate member states. I'll come back to some examples of these in a minute. And then we also have UN regional bodies. Now, the reason why I raise this is because each one of these different agencies will have some responsibilities in relation to statistics. Different amounts of participation in the statistical agenda for different agencies. So, for example, UNESCO has a rather large statistical activity with a similar size number of staff, about 75 statistical staff, as the UN Statistics Office in New York. And indeed, when I was Director of Statistics of that, I was the same grade as the Director of Statistics in New York. So some agencies have quite a large statistical capacity, others not. This specialist agency, whether they're sister or daughter ones, obviously collect data relating to their topic area. So relating to the subject matter of that specialist agency. Whereas the UN regional bodies collect data relating to the wide range of topics, but only in relation to their countries. So you have a matrix system with subject versus area, with quite a complex picture. So examples of the daughter agencies are UNDP, UNFPA, UNICEF. And in the main, these agencies tend to be users of data rather than data agencies. They don't necessarily get involved in a lot of data collection. They may get involved in data statistical capacity building, they may have some special projects and so on. So UNICEF, for example, has a special project called the Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey, which is a household survey that they do over a number of countries, but they're not regularly gathering data for all countries of the world. UNDP you'll be familiar with, because UNDP is very much bringing together data from the other agencies. So as Director of Statistics at UNESCO, I would report our data to UNDP on an annual basis, and they would include it in their indicators in the UNDP Human Development Report that comes out each year, that has a very fat appendix on performance of countries. So sister agencies, I've already mentioned UNESCO and the World Health Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization, UNIDO in Geneva, etc. Okay, so these agencies actually, in the main, do have a major statistical role. They don't necessarily have something called a statistics division. They may work like in WHO through sort of epidemiology and public health rather than statistics, but they do have statistical functions. And then the regional bodies of the UN, there are 5 regional bodies for Europe, Africa, Asia and the Pacific, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Western Asia. So that's sort of the UN system, and trying to explain that different agencies have different roles and different reporting responsibilities. What does an international statistician do? What does somebody do who works in one of these agencies? Well, they can be doing any combination of these activities. So they can be involved in capacity building, they can be very specifically involved with bilateral aid agencies and multilateral agencies in monitoring the effectiveness of aid. So OECD, which I'll come on to in a few minutes, has a particular section that works in that area. They can be gathering together and being guardians of the cross-national databases. They can be doing work in terms of tracking international aid, work in terms of analysis and interpretation of cross-national data. They might be doing methodological and technical projects, particularly in terms of improving the quality of data collection. So, for example, at UNESCO, I was very involved in methodological projects on how you measure literacy in a cross-nationally comparable way. They might be involved in advocacy for data at a national and international level. They can be very involved in promoting good practice in statistics and setting standards. And of course, a major activity is international classifications. And different agencies will have responsibility for different international classifications. So you've got ILO, which I haven't mentioned, which is a daughter specialist agency, has responsibility for classifications relating to employment. WHO, the one relating to health. UNESCO, the one ISCED relating to education, and so on. So they have responsibility for that international classification. So just to give you an example of the sort of activities of somewhere like the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, involved in the collection and dissemination of cross-nationally comparable data on the areas that UNESCO has responsibility for, which is education, science, technology, culture and communications. Providing a forum for sharing of statistical information, capacity building within countries for users and producers of data, of those sorts of data, analysis and interpretation of that data, often in partnership with others, and then these methodological and technical projects and international classifications. I mentioned earlier the UN Statistics Commission. The UN Statistics Commission is the main sort of committee that drives forward the international statistics work. It has an annual meeting in New York at the end of February, beginning of March. It works in a similar way to the Security Council, and there's a small number of permanent member countries. Other countries participate on a rotational basis, and all countries are invited and are observers in inverted commas. It would be very difficult if you sat in the chamber in the UN for you to distinguish between the rotational and observer member countries, because everybody gets to speak. The only way you would know is that there's a very strict order, the order in which people speak. So the permanent members are asked if they wish to make a contribution first, and so on. That's the only way you could tell. Everybody gets their opportunity to contribute. And everybody gets to contribute to the agenda and can put items on the agenda. There are heads of statistics for the UN bodies and for other bodies, for example, the Bretton Woods establishments, IMF, World Bank, etc. And regional organisations like Eurostat, OECD. and also representation from non-governmental organisations that are in consultation with the UN in respect of statistics, so the International Statistics Institute, for example. There's a regular programme of work. There are also ad hoc groups set up. Friends of the Chair, the chairman of the Statistics Commission, who is a Director General of one of the National Statistics Institutes, can set up ad hoc groups under his authority in order to address particular concerns or issues. So a few years ago, a Friends of the Chair group was set up because there was concern about the Human Development Index and whether there was proper quality assurance of the data going into that. So there was a Friends of the Chair group. There was a Friends of the Chair group set up because there was concern that WHO wasn't appropriately consulting national statistics institutes about its new methodology for health surveys. And then there are city groups, and city groups are groups of countries where a group of countries decides to work on a particular topic together. And they're called city groups because they're invariably named after the first city that the group of countries meet in. So we have the Oslo group in relation to innovation, and we have the Canberra group in relation to price statistics and so on. So there are a number of these. And if you want to look at what's cutting edge in terms of development, that's where you would go. There are also regional statistics commissions, but I haven't got time to talk in any detail about them, but they do a similar thing at a regional level. And the one for Europe, which you might be particularly interested in, the Regional Commission for Europe is known as the Conference of European Statisticians. And in order not to get too much of a problem between Eurostat, OECD, and the Economic Commission for Europe tripping over one another, that's actually coordinated across those three agencies. There is actually also a smaller group, which is the Coordination Committee on Statistical Activities, which is the specialist and regional agencies of the UN, other relevant bodies. And this comes together a couple of times a year. This is the directors of statistics for these regional and international agencies, okay? And they come together to share experiences, to debate differences, and so on, coordinate activities and work together. So most of the work that's taken place on the development of the protocols for sharing international data have been done under the auspices of this coordination committee. So one agency might take the lead, but it's a coordination effort. I'm coming to the end, I'm conscious of time. So where are policies on data set? Because at this meeting we've often had discussions about issues to do with charging for data and so on. Well, the first thing to say is that data collections, whether it's voluntary or compulsory, varies across agencies. So in UNESCO, for example, there was no compulsory data collection. You have to work really in cooperation with the countries and persuade them that it's in their interest to supply this data. You can embarrass countries if they don't supply the data, and of course the signing up to things like the Education for All goals and the Millennium Development Goals has pushed some of the data collection, so that we've actually seen improvements in terms of quality and completeness because of those. But it's a voluntary system. Some parts of the system, there are compulsory data collections, and we'll all be aware, I guess, that of course some of the data in Europe is collected under directives of the European Union, and therefore countries are required to supply it. So you've got different systems in different agencies, sometimes two systems working alongside one another within one agency. Who collects what is an issue? Concept of lead agencies is important. UNICEF is an agency that deals with children and families. UNESCO deals with education. There's an overlap there. UNESCO is the lead agency for education data and has responsibility for reporting on education data for the Millennium Development Goals. So there's usually an agreement that's resolved at this coordination committee. There will be agreement and discussions taking place about things like data formats. Pricing, however, has been a really particularly difficult issue because within agencies, who takes responsibility for pricing decisions will be different. So I was very lucky in UNESCO. As Director of Statistics, it was my responsibility. At OECD, this is not the Director of Statistics' responsibility, and actually the Publications Department gets involved. And as we've had discussions here in the past, there have been issues about the Publications Department relying on the income from selling data. So you get different agencies making different decisions. Different agencies relate differently to users. Some agencies, in particular Eurostat, now have user committees, and I would encourage you to get involved in that. My last slide, I should mention statistical capacity building. All of the agencies I've been talking about do get involved in statistical capacity building, but there are three things I should mention particularly. There are regional bodies such as the Statistical Centre at CIAP, which is Statistical Institute for Asia and the Pacific in Tokyo, that carry out major capacity building exercises, in that case for Asia and the Pacific. There are initiatives of bilateral agencies as well as multilateral. So the Department for International Development here in the UK gets very involved in capacity building in developing countries. And then there's something called Paris 21, which stands for Partnerships in Statistics for Development for the 21st Century, which was established in 1999, launched by Claire Short, and is hosted by the OECD, and it sets policies and coordinates activities in relation to statistical capacity building and represents the users, in this case the developing countries themselves, in the committees to sort out statistical capacity building. I'm conscious of time. That's, I hope, has given a sort of a context for the rest of the talk.